then again it was raised in this morning's presentation, and that's the topic of tariffs. And as we were putting together this conference several months ago and looking at the programming, we thought having somebody who's from outside the industry who can really, tell us a little bit of something about these tariff issues, not from a political standpoint of, what are the political ramifications, but what is the process? What's going on? What are these tariffs all about? What do we need to know in the industry? What might you need to know as either a procurement agent or a supplier or an industry executive, or even somebody, maybe you're an entrepreneur and you're considering, expanding your business. What are some of the ramifications? What's the process? What do we need to know? And how can we take some of that information back with us to make some of those day-to-day business decisions that we always make? So that's what today's session is about. We're going to have an expert on tariffs and really more about, the process, what it's all about, and then bringing us forward to what's going on today. What are we seeing in the headlines? And what are the things that you yourselves may do as you go back to your organizations? So that's our goal for today, and we hope you do have some questions to ask. And in this session, because this is a new topic for all of us, there are no questions that are not a good question. So please consider if you are confused or if you want to ask something, please do. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jeff Orenstein. His legal practice focuses on international trade and transportation issues with a special emphasis on U.S. customs, sanctions, and exports control. So again, I hope this will be a subject matter that's of interest to all of us in the room, and it certainly has been an interest to our speakers. Jeff?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And it has been an exciting year for folks like me who work in DC and do trade law. A lot going on, as most of you know, with tariffs, with sanctions, with export controls, lots of change in the law. And today, we'll try to focus on some of the key issues with tariffs that I think would impact a lot of your companies. Just a quick overview of what we'll cover. We'll talk about the tariffs that have been imposed by the United States on Chinese origin goods. And there are 3 major waves of those that have been rolled out gradually, and there's even a 4th that might be rolled out or has at least been threatened, and we'll talk about that. Some of the specifics about how those tariffs apply to titanium products, some strategies on how you can deal with them, ways to avoid them, ways to just deal with them as a business matter. One of those strategies is to seek a product exclusion. That's something that we help a lot of folks with, and we could talk about that process. And then also the steel and aluminum tariffs, even though those aren't directed at titanium. I think a lot of you manufacture goods and import steel and aluminum, and that might be of interest as well. And then very briefly talking about the state of negotiations with China and where we might be going from here. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball, so a spoiler alert, I don't know what's going to happen. But moving along. So let's start with the tariffs on Chinese imports. This is a really big topic, and one that's a really big deal. Actually, today is a deadline, and we'll talk about that, for trying to get an exclusion from these really high tariffs. So as I said, there are different waves of these tariffs that have come out. Some of them are as high as 25%. Some of them are 10%. And this is an additional ad valorem tariff on your Chinese imports. And the U.S. Trade Representative, or the USTR, has announced that there are these 3 different lists, and they're covering 3 different HTS codes. For those of you who don't know what an HTS code, that's the Harmonized Tariff System, the code that pretty much all countries use to classify goods. And so they've come out with a list of hundreds, in some cases thousands, of HTS codes that are going to be subject to these tariffs. China has done the same with its retaliatory tariffs. It published lists of HTS codes. And in this case, with the U.S. Trade Representative, they proposed various lists, and it underwent a notice and comment rulemaking process, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then eventually there were decisions made, and they published these lists. And in some cases 25%, sometimes 10%. There was a Section 301 committee that consisted of the U.S. Trade Representative, some folks from Congress, people from the Department of Commerce, working on what products should and shouldn't be on these lists. It gets a little political, but at the end of the day, I think what we saw is that the Trump administration really wanted to roll out big lists of tariffs to pick products that represented large swaths of Chinese imports, to be able to say, we've just imposed tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. I think that end number was really important to them, and it was very hard for people to lobby to get their products taken off of the list. So I mentioned the Section 301 committee. So the authority of this tariff comes from a statute called the Trade Act of 1974, Section 301. And so whenever you hear people refer to the Section 301 tariffs, they're just talking about the tariffs that the U.S. is putting on Chinese origin goods. And this gives the president a lot of authority to ask the U.S. Trade Representative to do an investigation, to use these tariffs as kind of a remedy against unfair trade practices and other kinds of issues. And in this case, they had the U.S. TR do a investigation. This is some time ago, over a year ago, and they decided that in their findings that there were certain trade policies and practices in China that they thought warranted the imposition of a tariff. Actually, they had three major things that they wanted to do. One was a tariff, one was a case before the WTO, and another was imposing new restrictions on Chinese investment on U.S. companies. There are already, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of CFIUS. That's a committee in the United States that already reviews any foreign investment in major U.S. assets. This would be additional restrictions above and beyond that. But we're here just really talking about that first one, which is the tariffs. For the most part, economists hate tariffs, and a lot of populist type politicians love them. I will leave that kind of academic discussion to others, but as a practical matter, there's some obvious pros and cons. I think from the U.S. perspective, the popular view is that the Trump administration is doing this to put pressure on China to get certain concessions, to walk away with a better deal. So the hope is, for those of us who don't love tariffs, that this is a short-term thing and that it's really just a negotiation tactic. Another potential pro is that domestic producers of some of the goods that are under tariffs will definitely benefit. And of course, any producers that are non-Chinese, that are competitors for Chinese imports, are going to benefit. But the cons are pretty clear. It's not just really a tax on Chinese exporters, it's really a tax on U.S. importers who rely on certain Chinese origin goods. Plenty of clients of mine who rely on certain steel, aluminum, other products that they can only get in China are going to be impacted very severely by this. And in some cases, these huge cost increases are actually more than their margins for profit, and so they have to really make major adjustments in their business. In some cases, it's a bet the company situation for them. And that's U.S. industry. So obviously it has some blowback, if you will. And then, of course, there's retaliation, and China has retaliated with its own tariffs, which was predicted, and that obviously has a cost domestically as well. So we talked about the three lists that have been rolled out for these Section 301 Chinese origin goods. I just want to quickly go through the three lists. The third list is the one that's really most important for titanium. But okay, and so this is the first one. It's currently in effect. It's 25%. And it was imposed on about 818 HTS codes. And originally that was about 1,300 were proposed, and they whittled it down a little bit. It went into effect back in July, and if you wanted to get an exclusion from this, and we'll talk about the product exclusion process because that might be of importance to some of you for List 3. But if your product, if you import a product that is on List 1, one of these 818 HTS codes, and you import that from China, it's subject to 25% tariff already, and if you wanted to get out of that, one of the ways was to request a product exclusion. The deadline for that was today. So, List 2, a much shorter list came out. These are a wide variety of products on all of these lists. So, unfortunately, I can't really kind of categorize it for you or describe it in general terms. It really does go across many different industries. But these are 279 different codes were on this list, and people have until December to prepare product exclusion requests for those. And then there's List 3, and as I say, this is the one that impacts titanium the most, and we'll talk about specifically the products that are on this list. This one's also different. The first two had a 25% tariff. This one is starting at 10%. It's already in effect. It started September 26th. But if this tariff is still in effect as of January 1st, it'll jump up to 25%. And there's a huge number of products on this list, over 6,000. And one thing of interest, we're talking about the product exclusion process. They haven't actually announced whether they're going to do one for this list. And I would think they would because they did for the first two, but I don't know if it's a negotiation tactic or if they're just overwhelmed with all the requests they've gotten on the first two lists, but they have not yet announced what that procedure will be. So we'll have to wait and see. That's something we're closely monitoring for a lot of folks. There's been threats of a fourth list of tariffs, and we'll see what happens. President Trump said that if they get retaliation from China on agricultural products and various other U.S. products, that they would consider a huge $267 billion in tariffs on Chinese imports. There have been retaliation tariffs from China, so we will see. But they have not yet proposed a list, and it takes a long time for them to do that. And there would be a whole notice and comment process to see if you can, lobby to get your product off the list. Very little success on that. I might mention on the last list, they published over 6,000 HTS codes, and many companies submitted comments, gave testimony explaining why this would be really bad for U.S. interests, for U.S. jobs, for U.S. growth, and really very few people got their products off of the list. U.S. Companies like Apple and some of the other big consumer electronics companies were successful in getting their products off the list. But the vast majority of folks in U.S. industry were not so successful. So they will have to take some other approaches to getting out of these tariffs, and we'll talk about some of those strategies in a little bit. So how does this impact titanium? Here is a list of the product categories. Now, these aren't individual products. These are the HTS codes. So these are, more general product categories. And the people in this room would be much more familiar with these products than I am, being somebody who's a lawyer and not somebody in the titanium industry. But you can see there's two main categories. You have the titanium and titanium dioxide HTS codes, and you have the mineral concentrates HTS codes. And you have, an HTS code like other titanium metal articles that captures a great number of things, a lot of medical devices, a lot of products made with titanium as opposed to some of these more raw commodities. Give you a sense that, with regard to sponge imports, we have at least 8% is being imported from China. So, the impacts there are really going to depend on, for the folks in this room, it really depends on where you're sourcing these goods. If you're not getting them from China, this is not going to impact you directly. If you are, it's already impacting you. To give you a sense of the numbers, these are the same sets of codes. The duties can reach up to 40%. Now, we were talking about the tariffs being 25%, but this is a really important point. If that extra 25% is in addition to any other regular rates of duty. So this gives you a sense of the regular duty for some of these categories when you're importing them to the U.S. When you add the extra 25%, in some cases that takes you to 40%. In some cases, it was duty-free, and so you're only up to 25%, although 25% is still very high, especially if you were counting on it being duty-free prior. So the numbers here are really impactful, and this is the kind of thing that really makes people have to change their product, change their supply chain. I won't linger too long on the economic effects of this for your businesses, because I think that's something that you all will, understand much better than I will. Obviously, if you are a domestic producer for some of these products, you're going to get a higher demand, and if you're a non-Chinese producer of these products, you're going to have higher demand in the United States. That's going to impact prices. That's going to impact pricing competition. Consumers are going to have to adjust to some of these shifts, and there's really going to be ripple effects. And it really varies widely between product sector to sector. And also, not surprising, this is going to, the kinds of sectors that we're talking about are going to be impacted. Is everything from aerospace to sporting goods, medical devices, pigments. Again, you guys know this much better than me, but we're talking about major cost increases for folks who rely on Chinese origin stuff, and it's definitely going to impact their costs, and they're going to have to make the kinds of adjustments that we were discussing earlier. Knock-on effects, obviously, this can impact U.S. Workforce. It can definitely impact the kind of capital investments companies choose to make in certain sectors. And it's going to impact competition. You're going to have exit from the market in some cases for certain products, and that's going to impact competition for that product. There's always winners and losers whenever you have these tariffs, whenever you have a trade deal, and so it's kind of hard to categorize in general, but it's the kind of thing that the U.S. administration is really not looking at too closely. I think they're thinking a little bit more short term, and it'll be left to us to sort it out during those while these tariffs are still in effect. So let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies. If you find yourself subject to some of these tariffs, what are some of the things that folks can do to mitigate the costs? First thing you want to do, really, and this is something we help clients out with quite a bit, is really make sure that you're actually subject to these tariffs. Now, your product is subject to one of these tariffs based on one of two things. It's the HTS codes that we talked about, but the other one is the country of origin. I've had clients that say, hey, we import this product from China, and this is going to cost us another, it's raising our cost by 25%. This is a huge problem. What do we do? And I said, well, let's talk about how you make your product. And when you're talking about raw commodities, the origin is not so hard. But when you're talking about a manufactured product, the country of origin can be very, very tricky. And I've had clients who assumed that they had a Chinese origin product because that's where they were importing it from. But the truth is, when you looked at the components, that it wasn't always Chinese origin. Sometimes it was actually mostly UK origin materials and manufacturing, and there was a strong argument to say that your product's actually not Chinese origin, so not subject to the tariff at all. So the first threshold thing you really want to do is make sure that you've got your country of origin correct. and you've got the HTS classification correct. Classification is very tricky. Again, sometimes you have an HTS code that is for a very basic commodity, but sometimes it's not so basic. Sometimes it's a manufactured product, and more than one classification code could apply. And even U.S. Customs, which administers those codes, has a hard time sometimes figuring out which box to put it in. So don't take those things for granted if you find yourself wondering if you're subject to a tariff. Also, on the country of origin thing, I should mention, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the substantial transformation test. That is the standard that Customs uses to figure out what the country of origin of your product is. The country of origin of your product, I've had some of you have already asked me about this earlier today. It could be, it seems like it should be such a simple thing. Where's my product manufactured? But in many cases, like I say, it's actually quite tricky. And one of the things that makes it tricky is that U.S. regulations have different standards for figuring out what the country of origin of your product is in different regulatory regimes. If any of you sell to the U.S. government, you might have, Buy American clauses in your government contracts. The Trade Agreements Act has the substantial transformation test. That's the same test that Customs uses for marking things, whether it's say made in India or made in China or made in Germany. But sometimes there's a different there are different Buy American statutes that have a different test that looks at the cost of components. If you're dealing with NAFTA, you're familiar with that there might be a tariff shift test. All these different analyses, you could actually have different countries of origin for the same product under different tests. If you're exporting to another country, you might be subject to a free trade agreement that has its own country of origin rules. And so it gets very complicated. You could, I've definitely had clients that had one product with 3 different country of origins for that same product. If you applied that test to the same facts, you got 3 different results. So that is an added layer of complication. So I bring that up to emphasize that for the purpose of these tariffs, it's the substantial transformation test. It's not some of the tests you might have seen for the Buy America Act or certain free trade agreements like NAFTA, things like that. And if anyone has questions about how to apply that test, we can talk about it. Another thing is shifting supply. That's intuitive enough. Obviously, if you're buying product from China, it's subject to the tariff. If you can get it somewhere else, great. That solves your problem. Sometimes you find that you have to pass on the cost to your consumer, but sometimes that is not an option. Sometimes you're forced to absorb some of that cost because price competition doesn't allow you to just raise your prices by 25%. Sometimes you can only pass on some of that portion. So those are some of the strategies, but there are more. One thing I would mention for any of you who have logistics personnel, you might want to talk to them about the idea of stockpiling some product in a customs bonded warehouse or something like that. So for example, I've talked to folks who say, well, I'm importing this, I'm going to leave it in the warehouse so I don't have to pay the duties right now. I don't need it right now. I could probably sit on this stuff for 4 months, and who knows, maybe the tariffs will be repealed by then. And it's possible. Of course, we could be here talking about this next year. But if those tariffs get repealed and then you enter it from the warehouse into U.S. commerce, then you won't be subject to the tariff. And so that might be one way to avoid it. Or, if you just need a little extra time while you get your ducks in a row to pay for some of these tariffs, sometimes it's just something you do for a month or so. So that's one possible strategy. Another thing is drawback. As some of you may or may not know, if you import something and then you incorporate it into a manufactured good and then export it, sometimes you can get back the duty that you paid on what you imported. So you import some titanium, you pay a duty, you manufacture it into something and you export that. It's very fact sensitive. I hesitate to generalize it, but that's something that to talk to your customs broker about or a lawyer. Sometimes you have that option. And then the last thing is product exclusions. We'll get into those in a little bit more detail, but we mentioned that already. There is a process for going to the U.S. government and saying, hey, I don't think the tariff should apply to my product, and this is why. So, talking about product exclusions a little bit more detail, who can do it? Anyone who's an interested party is the standard there, and that would definitely apply to anybody who's importing it, people who are buying it from the importers, sometimes even the exporters, although I think sometimes you get a better rate. You might have a better rate of success if you're the U.S. party who's importing, but that remains to be seen. Just jumping ahead a little bit. These, as I said, today is the deadline for List 1. Thousands of these product exclusions have been submitted already. None of them have been granted yet. So we don't know yet how the U.S. Trade Representative is acting on these. When we talk about aluminum and steel tariffs, I'll mention that the rate there has been pretty good, the rate of success. You're doing this for specific product. You're not asking for a product exclusion for a whole HTS code. So it would be a very specific product, and if you have multiple products, you have to do different requests for different products. This would, if it was granted, if I submitted a request to get my product excluded, anybody else in this room who imports that same product would be able to benefit from the exclusion that I got. It's not specific to the company who applies for it. It would be something that was probably published. We'll see. I assume they're going to publish these in the Federal Register or something like that. And then everyone would be able to take advantage of that product exclusion. Retroactive refunds, that's a really key thing. So, you know, these tariffs are in place now. If you get a product exclusion, you probably won't get one for months from now. But you'll be able to get a refund for all the tariff that you paid prior to getting your exclusion. It's really a no-brainer if you have product that you need to import that's subject to these tariffs. It's a no-brainer to go for the product exclusion. There's no fee. The only fee is, you know, if you were to pay outside counsel to help you prepare it. Some people do it in-house themselves, but it's really a low, considering the money that's at stake. It's a pretty low. There's no, if you get denied, there's really no negative implications there. Right. Okay, so what is the criteria for getting these product exclusions? There's really three main criteria. The first thing is your product available outside of China? You know, if you can make the argument that, look, I import this product from China and that's the only place I can get it from, that's a pretty great argument for why you should get an exclusion. I mean, what's the point of the tariff if that's the only place where you can get that product? Many people can't make that argument, but you might have kind of secondary arguments along the lines of, well, yeah, I can buy it in Italy for 3 times as much as I can get it from China, and that's just not an option. But they're going to hear a lot of that. Sometimes there's practical reasons, sometimes there's patent reasons, sometimes it's a proprietary thing, and you have, you know, something that's being made in China to your specific specifications, and to qualify a new manufacturer for that would be, you know, prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. So there's secondary arguments, but that's the first one. The second one is, does it cause your company and the industry at large severe economic harm? As I say, you know, everyone's going to be able to say that, well, this will raise my costs and that's bad. But what you'd like to be able to say is that this is really going to impact, you know, us in a more severe way. It's going to impact third parties. In some cases, it really is a bet the company kind of a situation. I'm aware of companies that will not be able to continue operation because everything that they sell in the United States is coming from China, and they don't have the option to shift to non-Chinese suppliers. So, and they're in a competitive environment where passing on 25% cost increases is just not an option. So, you know, that's a severe economic harm, obviously. And so you make the best argument you can on that front. And then the third one is whether this product is strategically important to the Made in China 2025 program or other Chinese industrial programs. And, you know, those programs are strategies that China has talked about publicly that are designed to kind of supplant U.S. and other Western competitors in certain high-tech industries. And so, you know, if your product is strategically important to those programs, it's going to make it less likely for you to get a product exclusion. But if it's, you know, a forklift, or if it's, you know, raw commodities, that's not what we're talking about. So So those arguments are brought to bear as well. But those are the three main criteria. Other arguments would be entertained, but that's really what they're looking at. Once you get those product exclusions submitted, there's about 14 days people can comment on it and object. And then after that, supposedly they're going to take action. But as I said, there's been thousands of applications, and they haven't really taken action on any. I think there's been about 20 denied, probably just for technical reasons. But they're really not approving them or rejecting them yet. And so it's not clear whether they're sitting on them or if they're just overwhelmed or if they're just hoping things will get repealed and then they won't have to. It's not clear yet. So shifting quickly to tariffs and aluminum, tariffs on aluminum and steel. I know that impacts some of the folks in this room, and it's a completely different regulatory regime, a different statute. These were authorized under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, and that really gives the president very broad discretion to adjust imports that impact national security. And a lot of people were crying foul on this one because it didn't seem like this was really about national security to some folks. This seemed like, just garden variety protectionism, which may be the case. But I think the administration's position is that obviously we have to have a domestic source for steel and aluminum. They're incredibly important to all kinds of federal priorities. And if we don't have a healthy domestic industry, if they're being undercut by low foreign prices or unfair trade practices or whatever the case may be, we have to do something to make adjustments. So that's what they've done. The Commerce Department is in charge this time. It's not the U.S. Trade Representative like with the Section 301 Chinese origin goods. Now we're talking about goods from all different countries, and it's the Department of Commerce that's administering that. And so they came up, they made a recommendation for a 24% tariff on steel and 7.7 for aluminum, but that ended up being 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. So again, as with the other tariffs, the two main factors figuring out whether it applies to you is the HTS code and the country of origin. These are the HTS codes for steel and aluminum. It doesn't tell you a lot about from those codes. There's just a ton of them, but it really does cover most things that are made from steel and aluminum. And again, what you're really going to want to do if you find yourself in a situation where you're wondering if this tariff applies to things you import, really pay attention to the HTS code classification. Don't just take it for granted that the folks in your logistics department got that right. Sometimes they had choices on which code to choose and didn't really get a ruling from customs to figure out which one really was the correct one because there was no difference in duty. And some folks are finding now that they were being a little bit too cavalier with their classification, and now that there's a lot of money on the line, they're taking a harder look at it. And so we've been helping folks figure out their classification. And in some cases, it's not clear, and what you can do is you can go to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and say, hey, can you give us a ruling on the classification for my product? And I think that's a good idea, especially when, as I say, there's a lot of tariff money on the line. So again, the tariffs are assessed by customs. They've been in effect since March, and the Department of Commerce has been basically the agency that's administering a product exclusion process, like the one that we talked about with the U.S. Trade Representative. Again, country of origin is essential, and again, it's the substantial transformation test that applies, not the NAFTA country of origin or what you might be used to from the Buy America Act or some of those other standards. It's substantial transformation. So you really want to make sure that you're checking your country of origin. Why is country of origin important? Okay, so here it's a little more complicated. Before we were talking about the tariffs only applied to goods from China. Here we're talking about virtually all countries, including Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. as many of you know, NAFTA is being revised, and the new deal being called the USMA did not solve this problem yet. They did not come to an agreement on the steel and aluminum tariffs, and the indications are that they're going to work on that, and my personal opinion is that they will resolve it because it's too big of a thorn in trade relations to just leave as is, but I don't know what the timing will be on that, and there hasn't been any significant progress yet. So for the time being, any steel or aluminum from Canada, Mexico, European Union, actually any country with the narrow exceptions of Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and South Korea are going to be subject to these tariffs. Again, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. With South Korea, there's a quota, so the tariffs could kick in again if we're importing more than the 2.68 tons. But short of that, you're not getting the extra tariff there. This is really impacting everything from pipelines to beer cans. It's going to impact aerospace, which I know is well represented in the room today, automotive, medical devices, construction, all kinds of manufacturing and fabricating. It really touches on too many industries to mention. Recently, Ford and Honda have, made some comments on how much this is impacting them. Ford has said that it's going to cost them $1 billion in the near term, and that's a company that sources most of its metals in the United States. Honda, similarly, for the cars that it makes in the United States, and it apparently uses about 90% of its steel for those cars is domestic steel. It's still facing gigantic cost increases due to the steel and aluminum import tariffs. And so this is going to, in fact, impact their prices. And it could impact their capital investments. It could impact their supply chains. It could impact U.S. jobs. Really, we will have to see. Those companies are big enough that they have options in the short term. But in the long term, we would expect some pretty big shifts. So again, product exclusions are an option here. The Commerce Department is doing it, and it's a little sub-agency within the Commerce Department, the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. They're the ones who are doing these product exclusions. You basically have a simple form. It's like an Excel spreadsheet, and you give them a lot of very detailed information about your product, and you're asking them for an exclusion from the tariff. There's two main criteria here. It's a little different than the other. You really want to be able to say that you cannot get this product in sufficient quantity or sufficient quality in the United States. If you can get your steel or aluminum product in the United States and you can meet your demand, even if it costs a little bit more or a lot bit more, you're probably not going to get one of these exclusions. But if you can show that really there's a reason why to meet your needs, you need to go outside the U.S., that's going to be the main factor. A ancillary argument that they have invited is national security. If you are importing steel and aluminum for projects that are important to national security, whether it be critical infrastructure or you have a government contract, obviously, people who are involved in defense systems clearly have that argument, but there's a lot of other companies that can make a argument that's maybe not as strong as someone who's in the defense sector, but like I said, critical infrastructure and things like that, you make the best argument you can. We find that they are granting these at about a rate of 50%, but I would say the 50% that are getting rejected, a lot of them are getting rejected because of technical reasons, people not really crossing every T and dotting every I on the application. So good to get a little outside advice on preparing those applications, but I think their track record on granting them has been pretty good so far. There's no deadline on those. There's no filing fee. It's kind of on a rolling basis. If you get rejected, you can just refile. They're saying about a 90-day processing time. They're not keeping to that, but they are getting around to it. So I feel like the Department of Commerce is doing a little better job than the U.S. Trade Representative is. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot to tell you that you couldn't read in the news on this. The question is, our negotiations with China, I should have, this really could easily just say China and the EU. Are negotiations heading in a good direction such that maybe these tariffs are going to get repealed? And the answer is things are not going well right now. The temperature is getting higher instead of lower. Chinese officials have said they can't really move forward with talks while the U.S. holds a knife to their throat with these things. The list 3 tariffs that were just imposed triggered some retaliation from China. And as I mentioned, the U.S. has threatened a 4th list. So I think I think additional tariffs are more likely before a deal is reached. I think a similar situation is going on with the EU. Talks with Mexico and Canada and China have taken priority, and EU has been, I think, sidelined a little bit, and those talks really reportedly stalled in September. I'm sure they'll resume soon, but there's a long way to go there. So the future on that is quite uncertain, and I think what people which probably should be bracing for, an extended period of tariffs. And we talked about some of the strategies for dealing with them in terms of, absorbing them, passing them on, changing your supply chain, seeking product exclusion requests, making sure that you have your classification correct, making sure you have your country of origin correct, taking a hard look at all of those things. Making any business decisions you can to try to weather the storm, realizing that this could be the kind of thing that you're dealing with for another year. I don't think it's sustainable for 10 years, but it can go on long enough that it really has a major impact on your costs. So. Not a great forecast, unfortunately, but that is basically the state of play. And I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
So again, this session, here's your chance. We don't oftentimes get somebody who's an expert in Washington on a topic that has been on everybody's register recently. And any questions, sir? Can we? You tell me I can.
I thought I saw somewhere that tariffs under Section 232 cannot be recovered through duty drawback. Is it your interpretation that Section 301 tariffs can be recovered through duty drawback?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking it, because I didn't make that clear.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was with drawback. We talked about that. That's a procedure where if you import something, use it in a manufactured good, and then export it, you might be able to get back the duties you paid on the imported components. And the question was, is that available for 232 and for Section 301 tariffs? And the answer is, with the Section 232 tariffs, that's the tariff on aluminum and steel, it is not available, which was an unusual move. With the Section 301 tariffs against China, Chinese origin goods, it is available. They've said that expressly. But thank you for that question, because they made an odd choice to not make it available for the steel and aluminum.
Now we're going to get you a microphone so everyone in the way back can hear the questions.
Good morning. We use a lot of tubing and plate, and a lot of our products go back offshore. Would it be appropriate for us to buy that directly, whereas currently we buy the finished product and resell it offshore? In other words, if I bring in my own Chinese titanium, is that a means to prevent the tariff as opposed to purchasing the finished goods and re-exporting?
It will depend on those two factors that we talked about, the HTS code and the country of origin. So it could be if we were talking about, if the imported plate was Chinese origin and that's on the list that we put up, you're paying the tariff there. Well, is the finished products tariff code also on the list? It's possible. And I wouldn't, we would have to basically look at the code and look at the list. It's actually pretty easy to figure that part out, and also to make sure that it's properly classified, so that that you're checking the list appropriately. But those are the kinds of decisions that folks are going to have to make. Those kinds of decisions, and again, the two big issues are the code and the country of origin.
So maybe just to follow up on that. So basically, you're saying as a strategy, you might have a less expensive, more raw material product that might be lesser of a tariff. Then you can finish it versus importing a further finished product, and that's a good strategy, or I should say, is that hypothetically a potential legal strategy?
Yeah, no, it is a strategy. So, I have a client I was speaking with last week who was saying, well, we have the ability to change where we assemble some of these things to make some of the products that they make. And they said, well, if we import just this component, which is really the most important component to get from China from a cost perspective, it's not on the list. But if we bring in the finished product from China, it's on the list. So making those kinds of choices, saying, well, what's on the list and what's not on the list, and how can we shift where we assemble, or making those kinds of changes to your manufacturing and your supply chain are strategies. Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned duty drawback as a possible way to recover tariffs. Can you also use temporary import bonds for either the 301 or 232 tariffs?
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes you can.
Another question over here? More questions.
You mentioned on the one group of tariffs, it applies to, if you get an exclusion, it applies to everybody, not just the person that requested the exclusion. We've been told, though, on Section 232, it's only for the person that requests the exclusion. Is that
accurate?
Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So with the Section 232 tariffs, that's the ones on steel and aluminum. Those are specific to you. Now, it doesn't. Let's say you're the user of the product, somebody else imports it and they sell it to you. There's choices on who can do the application. But it's going to be specific, the importer, whoever's going to be getting the benefit of that, it's going to be specific to that import. So like I say, it could be you as the end user, it could be the middleman that you buy from, supplier in the United States, that gets that exclusion. That is specific to the company. But with the Chinese origin products, the Section 301 tariffs, if my company gets that exclusion request granted, and as I said, nobody's gotten them yet, but if I were to get one, then anyone in the room that imports that same exact product would also be able to benefit from the exclusion.
Did you have a question? A quick question for you on currency exchange rates and what may happen in the future to balance out maybe some of the tariffs.
Well, thoughts? You're not an economist, right?
Yeah, no.
It's a good question.
It's a great question that I don't have the answer to.
But
I don't really have any insights for you on that. I mean, except to the extent that that's going to be so fact sensitive too. I mean, you're going to be. It depends on where you're importing from. Are you talking about specifically with regard to China? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not an economist either, but you may be watching, you can read this in the paper, particularly with the announcement this morning by the International Monetary Fund. I think that is a concern, the currency issues, that's something we probably should all just be made aware of. Whether, no experts in this room that are economists that can make predictions, but there could be some impacts. You have to watch that. More questions? Up over here.
Jeff, you spoke about the tariffs for Chinese product coming here to the U.S. Can you speak about what are the tariffs in place in China for U.S. imports going into China? And also how the relationship in tariffs between China and the EU. Can you speak to that? I'm not sure if you know.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of detail on that. And, you know, one of the things I've relied, one of the good things, I happen to belong to a firm where we have a pretty wide worldwide footprint. So I rely on my colleagues in Hong Kong to help me with the Chinese tariffs, which are, the details are all published in Chinese. So it's kind of handicapped me in my ability to get into the weeds. But one thing I can tell you is that the rates are similar, the lists are long, and there is no product exclusion request process there. You're just subject to it. So that's the main difference that I've observed. And I actually don't know anything, I'm embarrassed to say, about the tariff situation vis-a-vis the EU and China.
My understanding is that on Section 301, List 3, there are two parts. So there's one part with the second part with some sort of exclusion on them. I don't know whether you can actually be a little bit more details on two parts, second part of the List 3 of Section 301.
I'm not sure I understand a second part of, do you mean the second list of products, or do you mean a totally secondary aspect to it? Or?
I thought that there were two lists on List 3. There's one part covers majority of the HST code, but there's a part 2 of the List 3 with some exclusion.
Well, there are 3 lists, and as I said, the first list, all 3 are in effect already. And the first list has a product exclusion process. The second one has a product exclusion process, and the third one they haven't yet announced any kind of product exclusion process. I'm wondering if what you're thinking of is when they announced the first list, they announced 2 lists. One was about 1,100 products, and they put it under Annex A and B, and then they had a secondary list. So they announced like 2 proposed lists at the same time, and then they kind of broke out. So maybe that's what you're thinking of, but be happy to chat with you afterwards. Maybe try to make sure I understand the question.
Can I see another hand? You mentioned NAFTA briefly, and I know it's sort of, really more recent news. Any kind of high-level thoughts on where you see that impacting any of this, or is this something, we need to wait and see? Any thoughts?
We'll have to wait and see, but there again, and I had this conversation with some folks at breakfast, the key there is, again, country of origin. Now, with the in fact, that was the key to NAFTA as well. What a lot of folks don't realize that one of the reasons why NAFTA was so unpopular amongst certain sectors in U.S. was that it was very easy for you to make something in China, bring it to Mexico, do some simple assembly, and then say it was a Mexican origin product because the rules of origin were so liberal that way. Whereas the rules under the substantial transformation test that we talked about are much tougher. That would never have passed muster. They would have said, oh, well, the essence of the product was all made in China, and what you did in Mexico was simple assembly, and so it's still Chinese origin product. So that was what was so unpopular among some folks for NAFTA, and that's at the heart of what's being adjusted. And so we're going to have to wait and see what the final version of the USMCA looks like, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all rule of origin like the substantial transformation test. It'll be, I'm sure, like most free trade agreements, where you have to look for your product and see what rules apply, and then apply those rules appropriately. But I expect that it's going to be much harder, at least with certain product categories, to do what's been done in the past, which is to make Chinese origin goods Mexican origin through a really simple, inexpensive process.
Any further questions? Any other? Way in the back.
Hi, I was hoping to hear your thoughts on what you think the effect of the midterm elections will be on the tariffs.
Yeah. Well, it really, yeah, of course, it could go many different ways. You know, the USTR is part of the executive branch, and so is the Department of Commerce. So, you know, with the midterms, even if we have a shift in Congress, that won't really impact President Trump's authorities with regard to the Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Representative. Congress is not implementing these things. They're not holding the purse strings for their budgets in any kind of way that I think would have a major impact. It's possible if, you know, in theory, the Democrats could take control of the House and the Senate and pass legislation which doesn't get vetoed, that changes things, but that just seems almost too silly to mention because President Trump has veto power. So I don't expect any impacts from the midterms. In 2020, if we have a change in the White House, of course there could be major changes. I would hope that a lot of these things we've been talking about will be resolved before then, but who knows?
Okay. Thank you very much. Very informative. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.